Late at night, in a small room washed in the pale gold of a desk lamp, Pope Leo XIV sat before two very different kinds of paper. One was the official draft prepared for him, clean, measured, and careful in all the ways the world usually expects from men who stand at the center of history. The other was a stack of letters, slightly uneven, resting beside a rosary near the edge of the table, as if they had arrived from another world entirely, a world less polished, less orderly, and far more wounded. He read a few lines from the speech, then stopped, his eyes lingering not on the polished sentences before him, but on the weight of what waited beyond them. Outside that room was a world already tired of prepared words. Wars continued to fracture nations and consciences alike. Families still lived under the same roofs while growing farther apart in spirit, until home no longer felt like a sanctuary, but like a place where love had thinned into routine and silence. Children were being wounded long before they could name their wounds. The elderly were being set aside, not always with cruelty, but with the colder indifference of a culture that no longer knew what to do with frailty. The young moved through 1,000 connections and yet carried an ache no technology could soothe, because a person can be constantly reached and still remain profoundly lost. Everywhere there was movement, reaction, opinion, and noise. Yet beneath it all, there seemed to be a deeper emptiness, the kind that appears when a civilization has begun to lose not only its peace, but its soul. Pope Leo XIV did not sit there that night as a distant symbol wrapped in ceremony. He sat there as a man who understood that the burden of his office was not simply to speak, but to speak truthfully into an age that had become fluent in evasion. The world did not lack statements, explanations, or carefully balanced phrases. What it lacked was a voice honest enough to name what was decaying inside the human heart, and gentle enough to do it without surrendering to despair. And as his gaze returned from the tidy draft to the letters laid beside it, one question rose with unmistakable force. If Pope Leo XIV were to speak plainly to this broken world, where could he possibly begin? That night he understood that the world outside no longer needed another safe address, because something in him was already beginning to change before he spoke to anyone. If this message speaks to your heart, subscribe and stay with us, because what Pope Leo XIV is about to say may be exactly what this wounded world needs to hear. Pope Leo XIV let his hand rest on the edge of the letters for a moment before he chose the first one, as if he understood that whatever waited inside those envelopes carried more truth than the speech prepared for him. The official draft still lay open on the desk, precise in tone, balanced in language, and careful not to lean too heavily into grief, judgment, or urgency. But the stack beside it was made of another kind of testimony. The paper was slightly creased, the handwriting uneven in places, the sentences shaped not by protocol, but by suffering. When he opened the first letter, the room did not change outwardly, yet everything in it became different, because the words before him were no longer abstract concerns arranged into themes. They were wounds, and each one carried a human face. One letter came from a mother who had buried her child and feared that time, with its cruel efficiency, would do what death had already begun. Her plea was painfully simple. Please do not let people forget that my son once lived. It was not a political argument or a theological question. It was the cry of a heart refusing to let love be erased. Another letter came from a family whose house still stood, whose table still held plates, whose lives still appeared intact from the outside. and yet the bond that once made them a home had worn so thin that even ordinary evenings felt hollow. They wrote that there were still enough people in the house, but no longer enough love. A third letter came from a young person who no longer trusted his own future and no longer knew whether God still called someone as confused and compromised as he felt himself to be. Then there was the letter of an older soul who confessed, with devastating restraint, that at a certain age people begin learning how to live as if they have already disappeared. Pope Leo XIV did not need long paragraphs to understand what these letters were telling him. Each one opened a different fracture in the world, yet all of them converged in the same revelation. Beneath the headlines, beyond the slogans, and underneath the polished language of institutions, countless people were carrying grief, alienation, guilt, and invisibility in near silence. If he continued speaking as a statesman, he would betray the very wounds now lying open before him on the table. The world did not need another guardian of ceremony, another voice trained to remain impressive and controlled while human beings bled just outside the frame. It needed a father who was willing to come close to pain without hiding behind formal language. In that moment, the letters became more than correspondence. They became the turning point. It was those letters that forced Pope Leo XIV to set aside the voice of a diplomat and begin searching for the voice of a shepherd, answering souls that were crying out to be seen. The letter from that family did not stay confined to the private sorrow of one household for long, because in the mind of Pope Leo XIV it quickly opened into something larger, more painful, and far more revealing about the age itself. Their words were not merely about tension under one roof or affection that had faded with time. What they described was the slow collapse of a center, the loss of something sacred that had once held ordinary life together. A house may still have walls, a table, shared schedules, and the appearance of order, yet if the people inside it no longer pray together, sacrifice for one another, or speak truth without fear, then something deeper than harmony has already been damaged. Pope Leo XIV understood that the crisis of the modern world could not be measured only in elections, conflicts, or economic strain, because the truest crisis begins much earlier, in the first place, where a human being learns what love means. For him, the family was never just a social unit or a practical arrangement for survival. It was the first altar of society, the first school of mercy, and the first place where a child should encounter the difference between what is good and what is destructive. It is within the home that a person first learns whether love is patient or conditional, whether forgiveness is possible, whether truth is something firm enough to live by or merely something adjusted for convenience. That is why the weakening of family life meant more to Pope Leo XIV than the breakdown of custom. It meant the weakening of the very place where conscience is formed. A crucifix may still hang on the wall, yet no one lifts their eyes toward it. A dining table may still have every chair in place, yet no blessing is spoken, and no gratitude rises from it. A rosary may sit on a shelf, not rejected outright, but slowly covered by the dust of neglect. A child may learn to move across a screen before ever learning to fold small hands in prayer. These are not minor details of changing culture. They are signs that the spiritual center is cooling, and once that center grows cold, the damage does not remain inside the home. It spreads outward into language, judgment, law, and public life, until an entire society begins losing the courage to call things by their proper names. Selfishness starts presenting itself as freedom. Compromise with what is wrong dresses itself up as tolerance. Silence in the face of evil is renamed sophistication, civility, or progress. In such a world, confusion does not always arrive like open rebellion. Often it arrives as a soft rearranging of words until people become uncomfortable with clarity itself. Pope Leo XIV saw that this was why the wounds of the age ran so deep. The loss of truth in public life was not separate from the loss of truth within the family. When people no longer live honestly with those closest to them, they gradually lose the interior strength required to speak honestly about the world beyond them. This was the disease he was trying to name. He was not looking only at symptoms, only at headlines, only at the visible fractures that filled news reports and speeches. He was looking beneath them, toward the place where the soul of a civilization is first shaped. And he knew that when human beings stop living truthfully in the home, they also begin losing the courage to defend truth anywhere else before the pressure of the crowd. It began with the mother's letter. But in the heart of Pope Leo XIV, it did not remain only the grief of one woman. Her plea opened outward until it seemed to gather into itself the pain of all those whose suffering had become too inconvenient, too hidden, or too ordinary for the world to hold with reverence. She was not asking for policy, ceremony, or polished consolation. She was asking that her child not be swallowed by forgetfulness, that a life once carried, once loved, once known by name, would not be reduced to absence and then to silence. In that cry, Pope Leo XIV recognized something essential about the age before him. A civilization reveals its soul not by the strength of its institutions or the reach of its power, but by the way it treats the fragile, the dependent, and the unwanted. That is why his gaze moved instinctively toward all those who live closest to the edge of being ignored. He saw the unborn child whose existence is debated before it is defended, as if worth must first be negotiated before it can be recognized. He saw children already in the world, yet growing up in places where safety is uncertain, affection is interrupted, and rest itself feels temporary, like a borrowed shelter rather than a home. He saw women whose dignity is praised in language and violated in practice, the poor who are spoken about as a social burden rather than welcomed as persons, the elderly who sit in quiet rooms carrying entire histories inside them while the culture around them begins treating them as a finished chapter. He saw the victims of war, not as the moving figures inside a report or the statistics that pass across public attention, but as fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, and neighbors whose faces once leaned toward ordinary life before violence made that ordinary life impossible. This was where the voice of Pope Leo XIV became clearest, because he was not trying to speak from the side of power. He was trying to stand beside those who had no microphone, no platform, and often no ability to defend themselves against systems larger than they were. He understood that every forgotten person had once been welcomed into existence by God, that every vulnerable life carried a dignity older than governments and deeper than ideology, and that once a society begins sorting human beings into categories of usefulness and inconvenience, it has already wounded itself at the root. His words then could not sound like distant condemnation. They had to sound like the voice of a father refusing to let the weak disappear behind arguments, efficiency, or political convenience. From there, his thought moved toward peace, but not in the shallow sense that reduces peace to treaties, summits, or temporary pauses between public conflicts. Pope Leo XIV knew that war does not begin only at borders, and violence does not first appear in tanks, missiles, or uniforms. Long before it becomes visible on the world stage, it begins in hearts that have lost the ability to see another person as sacred. It begins in greed that teaches a man to take more than he needs, in pride that makes domination feel justified, in resentment that hardens instead of healing, and in habits of speech that slowly strip others of their humanity. A child does not wake one morning prepared to destroy, but a soul can be formed over time to believe that the suffering of another life is acceptable, necessary, or deserved. That is why peace, in his vision, must begin where the opposite of war first learns to live. It begins in homes, around tables, in the ways parents speak to children and children learn to answer, in the daily discipline of asking forgiveness before bitterness settles into identity. Peace is learned when a person chooses not to humiliate, not to retaliate, not to use strength as permission to wound. It is learned in the family before it is ever negotiated in government, in the living room before it is discussed at a border, in the recognition of one child's face before it is written into any strategy. For Pope Leo XIV, the defense of life, the protection of the weak, and the hope for peace were never separate causes. They were one moral vision, because the world is healed only when human beings recover the courage to see one another not as obstacles, not as numbers, but as lives that can never be discarded without betraying their sacred worth. Pope Leo XIV returned in his mind to the letter from the young person who had written with a quiet confusion that no public slogan could heal. It was not the confusion of someone lacking information, but of someone surrounded by too much of it and still unable to find direction. The letter did not ask for easy reassurance. It carried a deeper ache, the ache of a life that could no longer tell whether it was being led anywhere at all. Beneath the uncertainty was a question many young people now carry in secret. Does God still call someone who feels fractured, distracted, compromised, and late? Pope Leo XIV understood that this question belonged not to one soul alone, but to an entire generation. He saw a generation more connected than any before it, and yet less rooted, more visible and yet less known, surrounded by endless choices, and yet deprived of a true compass. Young people could move quickly through ideas, images, identities, and ambitions, but movement is not the same as belonging, and access is not the same as meaning. They heard countless voices telling them to build themselves, define themselves, market themselves, protect themselves, and never surrender too much to anything permanent. Yet very few voices called them by their truest name. Very few told them that a human life is not an accident drifting through time, but a gift shaped with intention and entrusted with purpose. That was why Pope Leo XIV did not want to speak to the young as if they were an audience waiting for motivation. He wanted to speak to them as souls being called. He did not want to tell them to behave better or try harder. He wanted to tell them that they were not born to dissolve into the spirit of the age, not born to become participants in a culture that fears silence, avoids sacrifice, and treats commitment as a burden. They were being invited into something greater. Fidelity was not outdated. Purity was not naive. A purposeful life was not a childish fantasy for the overly religious. Holiness was not reserved for a spiritual elite. It remained a living possibility in this age, even now, even here, even for those who felt unworthy of it. In this way, Pope Leo XIV restored hope without reducing it to sentiment. He saw that the future of the Church and of the world would not be changed by institutions or arguments, but by young men and women who understood that God was asking something real of them. A young person alone at night, unable to sleep after turning off a screen, might still discover that restlessness was not emptiness but invitation. A young couple learning to love might discover that love is not just emotion but vocation. God does not always call with thunder. Often he calls with a voice so quiet that only the willing heart can hear it, yet once heard, it can redirect an entire life. After speaking of family, of wounded life, of peace, and of the young, Pope Leo XIV arrived at a question that was simpler and more frightening than any public debate. Where do the wounded go? Where does a person go after failure, after compromise, after shame has settled so deeply into the heart that even hope begins to feel like presumption? He knew that beyond every argument about truth, morality, and fidelity stood countless souls lingering at the edge of return. Some had made grave mistakes. Some lived with private fractures they no longer knew how to repair. Some had drifted far from the church not through rebellion alone, but through exhaustion, disappointment, confusion, or the slow habit of absence. Others still believed in God in some hidden corner of themselves, yet no longer believed there was any real place for them inside his people. Pope Leo XIV did not want the Church to appear as a refuge only for the intact, the confident, or the morally polished. He knew that if the Church became merely a gathering place for those who already seemed whole, it would betray the very heart of Christ. At the same time, he refused to preach the kind of empty mercy that softens every edge until sin is no longer named, repentance is no longer needed, and healing is mistaken for permission. What he sought to protect was a far more demanding balance, the kind that welcomes without lying, that consoles without confusing, and that tells the truth about a wound precisely because the wound deserves to be healed rather than hidden. In his vision, the Church remained a home, but not a sentimental one. It was a field hospital for souls, a place where light still burned even when a person arrived carrying darkness, a threshold where someone could stand for a long time before finally gathering the courage to step inside. It was the place where a trembling hand could still close around a rosary as if gripping the last thread of hope, and where that hope would not be mocked. Pope Leo XIV wanted those standing outside to know that no one is discarded in the Church of Christ, yet he also wanted them to understand that the open door of the Church does not exist to deny truth. It exists so that a human being may enter truth without despair, be received without flattery, and begin again without pretending the wound was never there. That is why his tenderness mattered. It was not softness without substance, but the tenderness of a shepherd who knows that people do not rise through humiliation. They rise when mercy gives them enough room to breathe, enough truth to stand on, and enough love to believe that conversion is still possible even after a long season of distance for any soul that had almost given up. After speaking into the wounds of the world, Pope Leo XIV did not end by raising his voice higher or by multiplying arguments. Instead, he led the human heart inward, toward the place where all public crises become personal and all great questions become painfully small. After war, division, loss, and confusion, what often remains in a person is not clarity, but fear. Fear of tomorrow when the future feels fragile and uncertain. Fear of losing the people one loves and discovering how little can actually be controlled. Fear of not being strong enough to live faithfully in an age that rewards compromise and mocks endurance. Fear of being left alone with burdens too heavy to explain and too intimate to share. Pope Leo XIV understood that beneath the surface of history, countless souls are carrying this hidden trembling, and he knew that faith cannot always begin with triumph. Sometimes it begins with the honesty of admitting that one is afraid. That is why he did not offer a formula. He did not reduce suffering to an explanation or uncertainty to a lesson. He brought the listener instead to Mary, not as an escape from reality, but as the gentle place where surrender becomes possible again. In her presence, fear is not denied, yet it no longer has the final word. She remains the mother who keeps faith from going out when human strength grows thin, the quiet refuge where a soul can place what it cannot carry alone. The large words of the world fall back there, and what remains is the ancient need for a hand to hold, a mother to trust, and a mercy deeper than explanation for us all. There are moments when belief does not begin in confidence or power. It begins when a person dares to place fear itself into the hands of the Mother of God and discovers that surrender is not defeat, but the beginning of peace. In that movement of trust, something in the soul becomes still enough to go on. We return at last to the small room where Pope Leo XIV first sat before the divided witness of the table. The official draft still lies slightly to one side, orderly and composed, carrying all the polish that a great speech is supposed to have. The letters are still there as well, uneven and human, resting beside the rosary near the edge of the paper. Nothing on that table has changed in appearance, and yet everything has changed in meaning. The draft now stands for what is safe, what is measured, what can be delivered without exposing too much of the heart. The letters stand for what is real, what bleeds, what cannot be answered with balance alone. And Pope Leo XIV, having allowed the sorrow of the world to pass through him, can no longer pretend that the safer path is the truer one. He could have chosen a flawless address, one that sounded dignified, careful, and complete. He could have spoken in the language of institution and distance, giving the world another polished statement that offended no one deeply enough to wake them. But the mother grieving her child, the family whose home had gone cold, the young person unsure whether God still called, and the elderly soul learning how to live with invisibility had already pulled him somewhere deeper than ceremony. They had drawn him back to what mattered before protocol, before strategy, before the pressure to sound correct. They had drawn him back to the sacred things that a wounded age most easily forgets: life, family, truth, mercy, and hope. The objects on the table remain simple, but they now reveal the struggle of his soul, whether to satisfy expectation or to answer suffering with truth. That is why this ending does not need a grand conclusion. It needs only the stillness of a man who understands that a time of confusion is not saved by beautiful language alone. The world has heard enough prepared words. What it has lacked is a voice brave enough to protect what remains holy without surrendering to fear, fashion, or applause. There are nights when history does not need a larger speech. It needs a truer one. For in the end, the world is not preserved by eloquent words. It is preserved by voices that refuse to betray the sacred.